Our reading today is from Jan Richardson and is entitled Blessing for the Brokenhearted. Let us agree for now that we will not say the breaking makes us stronger, or that it is better to have this pain than to have done without this love. Let us promise we will not tell ourselves time will heal the wound when perhaps our waking opens it anew. Perhaps for now, it can be enough to simply marvel at the mystery of how a heart so broken can go on beating as if it were made for precisely this, as if it knows the only cure for love is more of it, as if it sees the heart's sole remedy for breaking is to love still, as if it trusts that its own persistent pulse is the rhythm of a blessing we cannot begin to fathom, but will save us nonetheless. This weekend, as you well know, is Memorial Day weekend, a weekend in which we honor the members of our military who have lost their lives while serving our country during moments of war or conflict. It's a weekend that we take time to honor grief, sacrifice, and the terrible realities of what it takes from us to both defend the values of our country and in some cases defend the desires of those in power. Traditionally on Memorial Day, however, we have not made time to grieve and honor those service members who lost their lives during or after the conflict due to the psychological, spiritual, and moral injuries they accrued while serving. For a significant amount of our military history, we spoke only of the physical injuries sustained by those serving our country. And when we did mention the invisible wounds, we used the limited language we had to do so, which did not always reflect the reality of the experience. Terms like nostalgia and soldier's heart were used during the Civil War, shell shock during World War I, or battle fatigue in World War II and Korea. These terms were a good first step to at least acknowledging that something unseen was happening within traumatized soldiers. They still failed to accurately describe their origins. The prevailing belief was that any underlying psychological symptoms were the results of physical ailments. For example, shell shock was thought to be caused by being so close to the boom of large weapons. While advances in understanding psychological reactions to trauma began in the late 1950s, they were still assumed to be short-term issues that simply required a bit more rest or transitioning to temporary lighter duties of a role. So because we lacked understanding of the origin of this kind of injury, we also lacked understanding of how to help the high numbers of devastated service members attempting to recover. Any attempts to preemptively stop the self-harm occurring in service members at such high rates as a result of this trauma were simply happenstance rather than research strategies. It wasn't until 1980 when Vietnam veterans, Holocaust survivors, and actually the feminist movement pushed for a deeper understanding of the long-term effects of veterans, civilians at the center of conflict zones, and other forms of survivors, that the term post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD of course for short, was coined. This was the first time the mental health community began to understand the physical symptoms they had always seen in traumatized populations: racing heartbeats, headaches, sleeplessness, and chronic pain, amongst others, were the result of psychological diagnoses, and not the other way around. We've since really embraced the understanding that the human experience is not just physical, not just psychological or mental, and not just spiritual, but that in fact we must understand how all of these parts work together to actually heal people. You can imagine that this shift in understanding then significantly changed the treatment of these conditions. Therapy, support groups, psychiatric medications, education of the medical personnel and family members that soldiers returned home to became the suggested methods of treatment rather than simply a few days of sleep or treatment of physical wounds. Today, those in healthcare have another term to describe what some veterans and active duty service members experience while in conflict: moral injury. Moral injury does not replace PTSD, they are separate. It just provides the name for a deeper understanding of the inner experience of suffering some soldiers experience. To quote an article from the Moral Injury Project, moral injury is the damage done to one's conscience or moral compass when that person perpetrates, witnesses, or fails to prevent acts that transgress one's own moral beliefs, values, or ethical codes of conduct. You may have also heard of the general term moral distress. And this is similar but somewhat different. Moral distress is caused by when you cannot do what's right, whether caused by inadequate support to conflicting values or even conflicts in your work environment, something like that. For those among us thinking this is a minor occurrence, however, you'd be wrong. An article from NPR named moral injury as the signature wound of today's veterans. So more and more attention is being drawn not only to its effects on present-day service members, but also shedding light on the experiences of veterans and people who have served from previous eras. So knowing this is such an important issue for our service members, what do we do about it? First, we address the barriers to care. This affects all of us. Part of the reason it took so long for us to reach our current level of knowledge and development of treatment options is the shame that many people experience following a moral injury. The key to continuing research and treatment of mental health for this group is destigmatization of these experiences and the suffering that follows from them, and destigmatization of seeking help to begin with. There's so much emphasis on what it means to be strong in our society, and specifically within the military. I mean, Army Strong is their marketed catchphrase, right? But that definition has historically been limited by the classic markers of Western masculinity: physical strength, mental toughness, emotional resiliency, and loyalty, duty, and courage. We know that for far too long, mental toughness and emotional resiliency has been translated to mean ignoring, diminishing, or self-medicating your distress. It's not a stretch to see that asking for help would be a challenge to those deeply entrenched in this ethos of strength. So even when the military began to understand how deeply this was affecting service members and their families, and finally started funding services to provide support starting in 2007, it was still a struggle to break through to those who needed it most. In reality, we needed and continue to need a new definition of the word strength, one that means taking care of yourself and your family by seeking out services to better improve your health, your happiness, and your life. An understanding of strength that means an alignment of soul to values, to action, one that allows for or even cultivates emotional intelligence. If we do this, we break down barriers for those seeking help and thus lower the number of future veterans we have to remember on this holiday weekend. There is another upside to this work. Creating resilient, mentally healthy, and resourced service members benefits the civilians they are surrounded by as well. Not just their families, which certainly benefit from that, but having a trauma-informed soldier interacting with a civilian in a conflict zone who are themselves traumatized by the same circumstances can only lead to less harm for both parties. It allows both parties to retain their humanity in the midst of unspeakably horrific events. Now, I'm not so naive. that I'm unable to realize that such shared empathy may make it harder to carry out the duties of a military at war. That may even be a sermon in and of itself. I understand the importance of national defense, and I have heard the arguments in support of creating service members who can simply follow orders without question. But we have lost our own humanity when we stop asking, at what cost? In asking this question, it is possible that our service members will have a crisis of identity. Who am I as a service member? What is it that I believe? Even a crisis of faith. One in which they reckon with both the events they have witnessed or taken part in and with the beliefs they have held firmly up until that point. Those with rigid boundaries of their faith, those who say things like, God won't give you more than you can handle, or everything happens for a reason, we just need to have faith, or let go and let God. They tend to find it a challenge to reconcile their real life experiences with this prescribed understanding of their faith. In fact, this type of theology is in and of itself often a barrier to seeking help to begin with. Because like the army, this theology connects spiritual strength to relying solely on God. Just pray harder. For our more conservatively religious service members, they must overcome multiple barriers to seeking psychological help. But once they reach it, it is possible that part of that healing process for them will include reevaluating their faith and allowing more flexibility in a once rigid theology. Truly, however, this question of at what cost affects us all. It's not just our veterans or active service members who struggle with these issues. Trauma affects all of us at one point or another in our lives to differing degrees, and thus many civilians experience moral injury and a crisis of faith as well. In fact, as the therapists in this congregation can attest, in our current political state, a significant amount of Americans experience moral injury or moral distress on a near constant basis. Each time we learn of another awful violation of our deeply held beliefs of who we thought we were as a country, because we have not always lived into those values, who we thought we were as a country, as a society, we experience the symptoms of someone who has moral injury, outrage, grief, stress, accountability, anxiety, guilt, a pervasive feeling of helplessness and sometimes hopelessness. And a perception that the ground we were once standing firmly upon is suddenly cracked, and that chasm is widening a little more each day. It, like those who serve for an extended period of time in conflict zones, rewires our brains, keeping us in a state of hypervigilance that requires a near constant series of reality checks. Is this really happening? Am I understanding this correctly? How can this be? How can we stop this? What will happen if we can't? If you have asked yourself these questions regularly, it is because we are being required to endure a continued violation of our values. The reason we are told to endure it is because it will create more money and more power. Not for you and I, but for those already drunk on both. So we must ask, at what cost? How do we counteract these injuries once we overcome the barriers to recognizing them? Aside from the obvious therapeutic interventions, I think a prescription for community, for faith, and for art are all warranted. Interestingly, we are experiencing this latest collective moral distress at the same time our country is struggling to hold on to each of those listed remedies. We're still remembering what community is and learning to rebuild it following the pandemic and the increasing use of AI as companionship. We are and have been for a while in the midst of a prolonged stretch of an overall devaluation of religion and faith. And art is becoming comprehensively defunded both in our schools and in our larger world. These things are worth fighting for. We need connection to others because it reminds us that we are not alone in our suffering. We have people who care about us and want to help us heal. People that we can find meaning in helping to support as well. We need connection to faith, something greater than ourselves, whether that's something be named God, the universe, or love itself, because it reminds us that we are worthy of healing, worthy of happiness, worthy of compassion. And we need the arts because they call us back to our shared humanity. We need them to heal that part of us that is untouchable by reason alone, that part that does not produce words to express itself, that cannot have a Band-Aid applied to it. We need people like our guest musician, Kashona, who see music as a way to heal the soul, or poets like William Carlos Williams, a physician and poet who saw the rhythm of language in poetry as healing, or artists like the yes-troubled Vincent van Gogh, who once said, "Art is to console those who are broken by life." These artists understand that art allows us to use metaphor and symbolism to process our experiences in a less direct way than traditional therapy, though talk therapy can, of course, still be helpful to many. As we continue to evolve in our understanding of moral injury and distress in our military, we civilians benefit from that work too. As we go about the rest of our Memorial Day weekend, I hope we can all carry with us that same sense of grief and gratitude for the service members who have lost their lives to the psychological, moral, and spiritual fallout after their time in service. May we continue to do better by them, by funding their medical and mental health needs, by modeling strength through self-care and compassion, and by caring for them when they seek support. May it be so. Amen, and blessed be.